I'm Victoria Hayes, 38, a senior investment director who just closed the biggest deal of my career, $2.1 billion acquisition that should have secured my family's future. Instead, my boss slashed my $85,000 bonus to bankroll his son's tech startup. The betrayal stung, but what happened next would expose a web of family nepotism that brought their empire crashing down before lunch. Sometimes the universe has its own sense of justice. If you've ever watched mediocrity get rewarded while your hard work gets stolen, like and subscribe for stories of truth and vindication. 12 years. That's how long I'd been climbing the ladder at Morrison & Associates, and every rung had cost me something. Late nights that meant missing Emma's soccer games. Weekends spent reviewing financial statements while my friends were living their lives. Christmas mornings interrupted by urgent client calls. I'd told myself it was all building towards something bigger, something that would make the sacrifices worthwhile. The Meridian Tech acquisition had been my masterpiece. 18 months of painstaking due diligence, navigating regulatory hurdles, and managing egos on both sides of the deal. I'd practically lived in conference rooms, surviving on coffee and determination. The target company's financials had been a maze of subsidiaries and shell companies, but I'd untangled every thread. When the final signatures were collected last Tuesday, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: pure, unfiltered pride. My career timeline read like a testament to dedication. Junior analyst at 26, fresh out of Wharton with more ambition than sense. Senior analyst by 28, after single-handedly salvaging the Henderson merger when my supervisor had a nervous breakdown. Associate director at 32, the youngest in the firm's history. And now, at 38, I was Richard Morrison's right hand. The person he trusted with the deals that defined our reputation. The money had never been just about me. Mom's arthritis medication cost $800 a month, and Dad's pension barely covered their mortgage. Emma's college fund needed another $40,000 to be fully funded. She'd earned her spot at Northwestern, and I'd be damned if finances would stop her from going. The $85,000 bonus wasn't just a number on a bank statement. It was security. It was possibilities. It was the tangible proof that my sacrifices had meaning. I'd always been careful with my expectations. Wall Street was littered with the corpses of people who'd counted their bonuses before they were paid. But this was different. Richard had personally assured me that the Meridian deal would be life-changing for everyone involved. He'd used those exact words during our quarterly review, his weathered face breaking into the rare smile he reserved for exceptional performance. That Tuesday morning, I'd calculated exactly how I'd allocate the money. $30,000 for Emma's college fund, $25,000 for my parents' medical expenses and home modifications, $15,000 to finally pay off my student loans. The remaining $15,000 would go into my emergency fund as safety net. I'd never been able to afford the email had arrived at 7:43 a.m. on Wednesday, marked urgent. Bonus adjustment. My hands had trembled as I opened it, expecting details about the payment schedule or tax implications. Instead, I found a corporate-speak masterpiece that essentially said my life-changing moment had been canceled due to strategic reallocation of resources to support emerging growth opportunities within our investment portfolio. Your performance bonus will be adjusted to reflect current operational priorities. The bureaucratic language couldn't hide the truth. They were stealing from me to fund someone else's dreams. Richard Morrison had built his reputation on two principles: exceptional returns and unwavering loyalty to his people. For 12 years, I'd believed in both. Now, I was learning that loyalty, like everything else in his world, was a transaction, and I'd apparently been priced out of the market. I stared at the email for 15 minutes, reading and rereading the corporate doublespeak until the words blurred together. My coffee grew cold as I sat at my kitchen table, still in my pajamas, trying to process what I was seeing. Strategic, reallocation, emerging growth opportunities, current operational priorities. Each phrase was a polished stone thrown at my dreams. Emma padded into the kitchen, her Northwestern sweatshirt hanging loose on her 17-year-old frame. "Mom, you okay? You look like someone died." Someone had died my trust in the system. I'd served faithfully for over a decade, but I couldn't explain that to my daughter, not when she was already anxious about college expenses. "Just work stuff, sweetheart. Nothing you need to worry about." She grabbed an apple from the counter and kissed my forehead. "Don't let them stress you out too much. You're the smartest person I know. If only intelligence could protect you from betrayal." By 9 a.m., I was dressed for battle in my sharpest suit, the charcoal Armani that made me feel invincible during difficult negotiations. If Richard wanted to play games with my livelihood, he'd face me at my professional best. I rehearsed my arguments during the drive to the office, my hands gripping the steering wheel as I ran through scenarios in my head. Morrison and Associates occupied 3 floors of a gleaming Manhattan high-rise, all glass and steel and carefully curated success. I'd always felt proud walking through those doors, part of something bigger than myself. Today, the marble lobby felt like a mausoleum. Richard's corner office was a shrine to his achievements. Degrees from Harvard and Wharton, photos with politicians, and CEOs' awards from industry organizations. The mahogany desk was large enough to land a small aircraft, and behind it sat the man who'd just shattered my faith in meritocracy. "Victoria," he said without looking up from his computer, "I assume you're here about the bonus adjustment?" Adjustment? As if stealing $85,000 was a minor accounting correction? "Richard, I need to understand what's happening. The Meridian deal was the biggest acquisition in the firm's history. My contribution was essential, absolutely essential." He finally looked at me, his blue eyes cold and calculating. "Which is why I know you'll understand the bigger picture here. We're not just managing money anymore, Victoria. We're cultivating the next generation of financial innovation." I sat in the leather chair across from his desk, trying to maintain my composure. "What does that have to do with my bonus?" Richard leaned back, his fingers steepled. "My son Trevor has developed a revolutionary fintech platform. Next-gen financial solutions is positioned to disrupt the entire industry. The algorithms alone are worth millions. Your son?" The words came out flat, emotionless. I'd heard Trevor mentioned in passing Stanford MBA, various startup attempts, the golden child who could do no wrong. "You're using my bonus to fund Trevor's startup. I'm making a strategic investment in the future of finance." His voice carried the patronizing tone he usually reserved for junior analysts. "Trevor's platform will revolutionize how we handle transactions, particularly in the cryptocurrency space. The potential returns are exponential." I thought about my parents, about Emma's college fund, about the student loans that would follow me to the grave. "Richard, I've been with this firm for 12 years. I've never missed a deadline, never lost a client, never asked for anything I hadn't earned." "This bonus represents what it represents," he interrupted. "Is short-term thinking. You're focusing on immediate gratification while I'm building an empire. Trevor's success will benefit everyone at this firm." The dismissal in his voice was like a slap. I'd seen him use this tone with underperforming associates, with clients who questioned his judgment, with anyone who dared challenge his authority. I'd never imagined being on the receiving end. "I see." I stood up, smoothing my skirt. "And the other employees whose bonuses are being adjusted? Are they also part of this strategic vision?" His eyes narrowed. "What other employees?" I hadn't mentioned other employees, but his defensive reaction told me everything I needed to know. I wasn't the only one being robbed to fund the Morrison family legacy. "Thank you for clarifying your priorities, Richard. I'll be sure to keep them in mind going forward." As I walked toward the door, he called after me. "Victoria, I hope you understand that discretion is essential in matters like this. The firm's reputation depends on maintaining confidence in our strategic decisions." I paused at the threshold. "Of course, discretion. I wouldn't want anyone to question the integrity of your strategic decisions." The sarcasm in my voice was barely concealed, but Richard was too arrogant to notice. He'd already turned back to his computer, dismissing me like a servant who'd overstayed her welcome. Walking back to my office, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the clarity that comes from seeing someone's true nature. Richard Morrison wasn't the mentor I'd revered. He was a man who'd steal from his most loyal employees to fund his son's delusions of grandeur. Back in my office, I closed the door and leaned against it, my heart pounding from the confrontation, believing that hard work and dedication would be rewarded. I'd been that naive once. I needed to understand what I was really dealing with. I opened my laptop and began researching the golden child who'd just cost me my future, Trevor Morrison, 28, graduated magna cum laude from Stanford's Graduate School of Business. His LinkedIn profile was a masterclass in privilege, masquerading as achievement. A year at McKinsey before pursuing entrepreneurial opportunities. The resume looked impressive until you realized it was built on a foundation of family influence. His first venture, Ecotech Solutions, had launched 3 years ago with great fanfare about revolutionizing green energy investment. The company's website was still live, though it hadn't been updated since 2022, according to archived press releases. Ecotech had raised $2.3 million in seed funding from strategic investors, a euphemism for Richard's client base. I suspected the company had folded 18 months later, citing challenging market conditions. Urban Delivery Network came next, promising to disrupt last-mile logistics through a AI-powered route optimization. More impressive-sounding buzzwords, more funding from mysterious strategic investors, more inevitable failure. The pattern was becoming clear. Trevor had a talent for packaging mediocre ideas, and his latest attempt to prove he'd inherited his father's business acumen. The company's website featured stock photos of diverse professionals looking thoughtfully at computer screens. Integration? The language was so generic it could have been generated by an AI trained on startup pitch decks. I'd seen enough failed fintech startups to recognize the warning signs. Real innovation in financial technology required deep technical expertise, regulatory knowledge, and years of patient development. Trevor's ventures had the lifespan of mayflies burning through money before disappearing into the entrepreneurial graveyard. But understanding Trevor's incompetence only made Richard's betrayal more painful. He'd stolen my bonus money I'd earned through 18 months of grinding work to fund another guaranteed failure. It wasn't just theft, it was stupid theft. The photo on Richard's desk came back to me. Richard and Trevor at some charity gala, both wearing tuxedos and forced smiles. Trevor had his father's height and jaw, but none of the gravitas that made Richard formidable. In boardrooms, where Richard projected authority, Trevor looked like he was playing dress-up in his father's clothes. I remembered the stories Richard had shared over the years. Trevor's acceptance to Stanford, Trevor's summer at Goldman, Trevor's brilliant insights during family dinners. At the time, I'd found Richard's paternal pride endearing. Now I understood it was something darker, a father so desperate to validate his legacy that he'd sacrifice his employees' livelihoods to fund his son's delusions. The psychology was textbook. Richard had built Morrison and Associates from nothing, clawing his way to respectability through sheer force of will. He'd married well. Trevor's mother had come from old money, but she died when Trevor was 12. Since then, it had been just Richard and his son, two men trying to fill a void that money couldn't touch. Trevor represented everything Richard had never been. Born into privilege, educated at elite institutions, connected to the right people from birth. But privilege without competence was a dangerous combination, and Richard's attempts to manufacture success for his son were destroying the firm's integrity. I thought about the other employees whose bonuses had been adjusted. How many talented people had seen their hard work redirected to fund Trevor's fantasies, tightened their belts so that Richard Morrison could play venture capitalist with his son's future? The Stanford MBA diploma hanging in Richard's office wasn't just a symbol of Trevor's education. It was a monument to everything wrong with nepotism in American business. It represented the belief that pedigree trumped performance, that family connections mattered more than actual results, that failure could be funded indefinitely if your last name was on the building. As I stared at Trevor's latest website, with its stock photos and empty promises, I felt something crystallize in my chest. This wasn't just about my stolen bonus anymore. This was about a system that rewarded mediocrity and punished merit, that allowed incompetent children to fail upward while dedicated employees watched their futures disappear into black holes of privilege. Trevor Morrison had never earned anything in his life. That evening, I sat in my home office surrounded by printouts and laptop screens, feeling like a detective assembling evidence for a case I wished I'd never had to build. Emma was at her friend's house working on a chemistry project, which gave me the solitude I needed to dive deep into Morrison and Associates' financial records. My position as senior investment director granted me access to most of the firm's internal documents, a privilege I'd never abused until now. But if Richard was playing fast and loose with employee compensation, I needed to understand the full scope of his manipulation. The company's financial statements told a story that made my stomach turn. Over the past 3 years, there had been a pattern of discretionary reallocations that I'd never noticed before. Bonuses earmarked for specific employees had been mysteriously redirected to strategic investment opportunities. The amounts were staggering: $127,000 from the Henderson deal team, $95,000 from the Pinnacle Acquisition Group, $78,000 from various individual performers. Each reallocation coincided with one of Trevor's startup launches. Ecotech Solutions had received its initial funding just weeks after the Henderson team's bonuses had been adjusted. Urban Delivery Network's seed round had been financed through similar sleight of hand. The pattern was so obvious once you knew what to look for. Richard had been systematically stealing from his employees to fund his son's failures. I cross-referenced the dates with personnel files, trying to understand who had been affected. Sarah Chen from the Henderson team had left the firm 6 months after her bonus disappeared, citing better opportunities elsewhere. Marcus Williams had taken a position with a competing firm after his Pinnacle bonus evaporated. The turnover rate among high performers had been increasing, and now I understood why. These weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. They were people's lives, their children's educations, their parents' medical care, their dreams deferred or abandoned entirely. Richard had built his son's entrepreneurial career on the broken backs of his most dedicated employees. The documentation was meticulous, probably because Richard never expected anyone to connect the dots. Each transfer was carefully coded as a strategic investment or business development opportunity. The accounting was technically legal. The money was going to legitimate business ventures, just not the ones employees had been promised. But legal and ethical were two different standards. Richard was violating every principle of trust and fairness that supposedly governed our industry. He was stealing earned compensation and gambling it on his son's incompetence. Knowing that the losses would never touch his own wealth, I dug deeper into the investment portfolio, looking for other irregularities. The Hendricks family trust caught my attention immediately. Robert and Margaret Hendricks, both in their 70s, had entrusted Richard with managing their retirement savings 3 years ago. The account showed steady, conservative growth, exactly what elderly clients needed for security, but the underlying documentation told a different story. Funds from the Hendricks account had been temporarily redeployed to high-risk ventures, including Trevor's startups. The returns on paper looked legitimate because Richard was using profits from other clients to cover the paper trail. He was running a sophisticated shell game, moving money between accounts to hide his unauthorized gambling with people's life savings. The scope of the potential fraud was breathtaking. If the SEC ever audited Morrison and Associates, Richard wouldn't just lose his licenseed face. Federal charges. The man I'd respected for 12 years was risking everything: his firm, his reputation, his freedom, and his clients' financial security, all to fund his son's delusions of entrepreneurial grandeur. I leaned back in my chair, my hands shaking slightly as I processed what I'd discovered. This wasn't just about my stolen bonus anymore. Richard Morrison was potentially defrauding elderly clients, stealing from dedicated employees, and violating every fiduciary duty that regulated our industry. The ethical dilemma was crushing. Reporting Richard would destroy the firm, eliminate dozens of jobs, and probably end my career in finance. But staying silent made me complicit in ongoing fraud that was ruining people's lives. I thought about the Hendricks couple, trusting their retirement to a man who was gambling their security on cryptocurrency fantasies. I thought about Sarah Chen and Marcus Williams, talented professionals driven away by theft disguised as corporate strategy. I thought about my own daughter, and the lesson I'd be teaching her about standing up for what's right. The laptop screen glowed in my darkened office, displaying evidence of crimes that could send Richard to federal prison. Tomorrow, I'd have to decide whether I had the courage to use it. Sleep had been impossible. I'd spent the night staring at the ceiling, wrestling with the implications of what I'd discovered. By 5 a.m., I gave up on rest and returned to my investigation, driven by a growing sense of urgency that time was running out for the clients being defrauded, for the employees being robbed, and for my own conscience. The Hendricks family trust documents painted a picture that made my blood run cold. Robert Hendricks was 73, a retired mechanic who'd worked 45 years to build a modest retirement nest egg. Margaret was 71, a former elementary school teacher whose pension barely covered their monthly medications. Together, they'd saved $1.2 million, not wealthy by Manhattan standards, but enough to maintain their dignity and independence in their golden years. Richard had convinced them to invest conservatively, promising steady returns and capital preservation. The quarterly statements they received showed exactly that: boring, reliable growth that would sustain them through retirement. But the underlying portfolio told a horrifying, different story. Nearly $400,000 of their savings had been diverted into Trevor's ventures over the past 2 years. The money had been moved through a complex web of shell companies and temporary investment vehicles, all designed to obscure the paper trail. When Trevor's startups inevitably failed, the losses were covered by profits from other clients' accounts, creating an elaborate Ponzi scheme that kept the fraud hidden. The documentation was a masterclass in financial manipulation. Richard had created fake investment entities with names like Hendricks Conservative Growth Fund and Retirement Security Portfolio, vehicles that existed only on paper to justify unauthorized fund transfers. The elderly couple thought their money was safely invested in blue-chip stocks and government bonds. In reality, it was being gambled on cryptocurrency platforms and artificial intelligence algorithms that existed primarily in Trevor's imagination. I traced the money through multiple transactions, each one carefully disguised as a legitimate investment decision. The sophistication was impressive and terrifying. Richard had been planning this fraud for years, building infrastructure to steal from clients while maintaining plausible deniability. But the Hendricks weren't the only victims. The Patterson charitable foundation, established to provide scholarships for underprivileged students, had seen $200,000 diverted to Trevor's startups. The Wilson Estate Trust, designed to care for a disabled adult child, was missing $150,000 altogether. I identified over $2 million in client funds that had been illegally diverted to finance Trevor's entrepreneurial fantasies. Each theft was a betrayal of the most fundamental principle in our industry: fiduciary responsibility. These people had trusted Richard with their life savings, their children's futures, their charitable legacies. He'd responded by treating their accounts as his personal ATM, funding his son's failures with other people's dreams. The psychological profile was becoming clearer. Richard wasn't just a doting father, he was a man whose identity was so wrapped up in his son's success that he'd sacrifice everything to manufacture it. The prestigious firm, the wealthy clients, the reputation for integrity, all of it was expendable if it meant Trevor could finally achieve something worthy of the Morrison name. I found evidence of Richard's desperate attempts to cover Trevor's failures. When Ecotech Solutions collapsed, Richard had personally guaranteed the company's debts to prevent investors from asking uncomfortable questions. When Urban Delivery Network ran out of cash, he'd used client funds to keep the lights on for an extra 6 months. He was throwing good money after bad, hoping that persistence could overcome incompetence. The current situation with NextGen Financial Solutions was even more precarious. Trevor's cryptocurrency platform was burning through cash at an alarming rate, with no viable revenue model in sight. The company's burn rate was $75,000 per month, funded entirely by stolen bonuses and client assets. At the current pace, Richard would need to steal another $500,000 just to keep his son's latest delusion alive through the end of the year. I pulled up Trevor's personal financial records, accessible through the family trust documents. Despite 3 failed startups and no legitimate income, he was living like a successful entrepreneur. A $6,000 per month apartment in Soho, a BMW lease that costs more than most people's annual salaries, country club memberships, expensive vacations, and a lifestyle funded entirely by his father's crimes. The irony was bitter. Trevor was living the American dream of entrepreneurial success while contributing absolutely nothing to society. Meanwhile, hardworking employees and trusting clients were paying for his lifestyle through theft, disguised as investment strategy. As I compiled the evidence, I realized I was holding the keys to Richard's destruction. The paper trail was so clear that any competent prosecutor could build an airtight case for fraud, embezzlement, and violation of fiduciary duty. Richard would face decades in federal prison, and Trevor would finally experience the consequences his privilege had always protected him from. But using this information would also destroy innocent people. The firm's legitimate employees would lose their jobs, clients would face years of litigation to recover their stolen assets. The financial media would have a field day with the scandal, probably destroying any chance I'd have of continuing my career in investment management. I stared at the evidence spread across my desk: bank records, investment documents, transfer, authorizations, and email communications that painted a complete picture of systematic fraud. The weight of responsibility was crushing. These documents could deliver justice, but they could also destroy everything I'd worked to build. The sun was rising over Manhattan, casting long shadows across my home office. In a few hours, I'd have to face Richard across a conference table, pretending I didn't know he was a criminal who'd stolen my future too, fund his son's incompetence. The question was no longer whether Richard deserved to be exposed. The question was whether I had the courage to light the match that would burn down everything around us. Friday arrived with the weight of inevitability. I'd spent 2 sleepless nights wrestling with my conscience, and the dark circles under my eyes told the story of my internal struggle. The evidence of Richard's crimes sat in my home safe, like a loaded weapon, waiting for me to decide whether to use it. Richard had mentioned during our confrontation that Trevor would be meeting with potential investors today, a lunch meeting that could determine the future of NextGen Financial Solutions. The irony wasn't lost on me while I debated whether to expose their fraud. They were actively seeking new victims to sustain it. I couldn't focus on work. Every client call felt hollow. Every financial analysis seemed pointless when I knew that firm's foundation was built on theft. Around 11 a.m., I made a decision that would change everything. I needed to see Trevor Morrison in action, to understand exactly what kind of person my stolen bonus was funding. The restaurant was L.A. Bernardine. Naturally, nothing but the best for the Morrison family, even when they were spending other people's money. I arrived 15 minutes early and requested a table with a clear view of the main dining room, telling the hostess I was expecting an important business contact. Trevor arrived at noon sharp, and I recognized him immediately from the family photos in Richard's office. But seeing him in person was different. He carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences for failure. His navy suit was perfectly tailored, his handshake firm and practiced, his smile polished to investment-grade perfection. The two investors he was meeting looked like seasoned professionals, a silver-haired woman in her 50s and a younger man with the sharp intensity of someone who'd built his fortune through careful analysis rather than inheritance. They introduced themselves with business cards and measured pleasantries, the kind of ritualistic dance that preceded serious financial discussions. I ordered a salad I had no intention of eating and positioned myself to overhear their conversation. The restaurant's acoustics worked in my favor. Voices carried further than people realized when they were focused on making impressions. Trevor launched into his presentation with the enthusiasm of a true believer. Next-gen financial solutions would revolutionize cryptocurrency transactions through proprietary blockchain optimization algorithms. The technical jargon flowed smoothly, but I could hear the emptiness beneath the buzzwords. He was reciting memorized talking points without understanding their implications. The female investor leaned forward, her expression skeptical. Walk us through your user acquisition strategy. How do you plan to compete with established platforms like Coinbase and Binance? Trevor's confidence wavered slightly. We're not competing directly with traditional exchanges. Our platform targets institutional investors who need enhanced security protocols and faster transaction processing. What's your current transaction volume? The male investor asked. We're in beta testing phase, focusing on platform optimization before scaling user adoption. Translation: they had no users, no revenue, and no viable path to either. The investors exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their assessment of Trevor's competence. The conversation continued for 20 minutes, with Trevor growing increasingly defensive as the investors pressed for specifics. When asked about his previous entrepreneurial experience, he glossed over the failures of Ecotech Solutions and Urban Delivery Network, describing them as valuable learning experiences that informed our current strategy. I watched the investors' body language shift from polite interest to professional skepticism. They'd clearly done their homework on Trevor's track record, and they weren't impressed by what they'd found. Then the male investor asked the question that changed everything. Given your previous venture's outcomes, what assurances can you provide that NextGen will achieve sustainable profitability? Our due diligence indicates significant capital burn rates without corresponding revenue generation. Trevor's polished facade cracked. Every successful entrepreneur faces initial challenges. What matters is vision, persistence, and the ability to learn from setbacks. My father's firm has a proven track record of identifying transformative opportunities. We're not investing in your father's firm, the woman interrupted. We're evaluating your company's independent merit. Can you provide audited financial statements for NextGen's operations? The silence stretched uncomfortably. Trevor fidgeted with his water glass, clearly struggling to formulate a response that wouldn't expose the truth. His company was a house of cards built on stolen money. Our financial structure is somewhat complex due to strategic partnerships and phased capital deployment, he finally said. But I can assure you that our backing is solid and our runway is sufficient for aggressive growth initiatives. I almost felt sorry for him. He was drowning in his own incompetence, grasping for credibility he'd never earned, defending a business model that existed only in his imagination. But then I remembered my stolen bonus, the Hendricks couple's retirement savings, the pattern of theft that had funded this moment of privileged failure. The investors thanked Trevor for his time with the kind of polite dismissal that meant they'd made their decision. They would not be funding NextGen Financial Solutions, and from their expressions, they wouldn't be recommending it to anyone else either. As Trevor sat alone at his table, staring at the check that would probably be paid with more stolen money, I realized something profound. Justice didn't always require intervention. Sometimes the universe provided its own reckoning, and incompetence was its own punishment. But as I watched him signal for the bill, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Trevor was making a phone call, probably to his father. Probably to report the failed meeting. Richard would respond the same way he always did, by stealing more money to keep his son's delusions alive. The restaurant receipt would show a timestamp of 1:47 p.m., the exact moment when Trevor Morrison's latest failure sealed his father's fate. I was gathering my things to leave when something unexpected happened. The two investors didn't get up from their table. Instead, they ordered coffee and began what appeared to be a serious debriefing conversation. Professional curiosity got the better of mine. Just witnessed a spectacular pitch failure, and I wanted to understand how experienced investors processed such obvious incompetence. The woman pulled out a leather portfolio and began reviewing documents. That was exactly what we expected, she said to her colleague. Trevor Morrison fits the profile: perfectly privileged background, multiple failed ventures, and a complete disconnect from financial reality. My pulse quickened. They'd known, going into the meeting, that Trevor was incompetent. This hadn't been a legitimate investment opportunity. had been something else entirely. The man leaned forward, lowering his voice. The due diligence report confirms everything we suspected. Ecotech Solutions burned through $2.3 million in 18 months with no viable product. Urban Delivery Network lasted 14 months and never generated a single dollar of revenue. The pattern is consistent with someone who has access to unlimited funding through non-traditional channels. Due diligence report? They'd investigated Trevor's background more thoroughly than any legitimate investor would for a cold pitch meeting. This was beginning to feel less like a business lunch and more like an interrogation. The financial forensics are particularly interesting, the woman continued. The seed funding for both previous ventures came from Morrison & Associates client accounts, though it's been carefully disguised through shell companies and temporary investment vehicles. Richard Morrison has been systematically stealing from his clients to fund his son's fantasies. I nearly dropped my water glass. These weren't investors, they were investigators, and they already knew everything I'd discovered through my own research. The man consulted his notes. The Hendricks Family Trust alone has been depleted by over $400,000. The Patterson Charitable Foundation is missing $200,000. We've identified at least $2 million in client funds that have been diverted to Trevor's ventures over the past 3 years. They had the same information I'd compiled, but their documentation was even more comprehensive. These people had resources and expertise that went far beyond what I could access as a senior investment director. The employee bonus diversions are particularly egregious, the woman added. Sarah Chen, Marcus Williams, and now Victoria Hay, professionals whose earned compensation has been stolen to fund guaranteed failures. The pattern shows escalating desperation as Trevor's ventures continue to collapse. Hearing my name sent a chill down my spine. They knew about my stolen bonus, which meant they'd been investigating Morrison & Associates for longer than just Trevor's current startup. This was a comprehensive investigation into systematic fraud. The man pulled out another document. The SEC referred this case to us 6 weeks ago. Morrison's trading patterns triggered automated fraud detection algorithms, unusual fund transfers, unauthorized account access, and client assets being moved through suspicious investment vehicles. SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, the federal agency responsible for investigating financial crimes. These weren't private investigators or competing firms gathering intelligence. They were working with federal regulators to build a criminal case against Richard Morrison. Trevor's meeting today was perfect, the woman continued. His inability to provide basic financial information, his defensive responses about previous failures, and his obvious reliance on family connections all support our assessment that he's an unwitting accomplice to his father's crimes. Unwitting accomplice? Trevor might be incompetent, but in the eyes of federal investigators, he was still complicit in a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme. His privileged ignorance wouldn't protect him from criminal liability. What's our timeline for the arrests? The man asked. Federal agents will execute search warrants Monday morning. Richard Morrison will be arrested at his office, and Trevor will be taken into custody at his apartment. We have enough evidence for multiple felony charges: wire fraud, embezzlement, violation of fiduciary duty, and conspiracy to commit securities fraud. Monday morning, in 3 days, Richard's carefully constructed empire would collapse in handcuffs and federal search warrants. Trevor's latest startup would be shuttered along with his father's firm. The Morrison family legacy would end in criminal court. What about the employees and clients? The woman asked. Asset recovery will begin immediately. The court will appoint a receiver to manage client accounts and ensure restitution. Most clients should recover their full investments, though. It may take months to unwind the shell companies and trace all the diverted funds. They were talking about my colleagues, my clients, people I'd worked with for 12 years. The firm would be destroyed, but at least the victims would be made whole. The stolen bonuses would be returned. The elderly clients would get their retirement savings back, and the charitable foundations would be restored. I sat frozen in my chair, processing the magnitude of what I'd overheard. The investigation I'd been contemplating in my home office was already complete. Federal agents had been building their case for weeks, probably months. Richard's crimes hadn't gone unnoticed. They'd triggered automated detection systems designed to catch exactly this kind of sophisticated fraud. The irony was overwhelming. I'd been agonizing over whether to expose Richard's crimes, wrestling with the ethical implications of destroying the firm. Meanwhile, federal investigators had already made that decision for me. Justice was coming whether I had the courage to pursue it or not. As the investigators packed up their materials and prepared to leave, I realized something profound. The universe really did have its own sense of justice. Richard Morrison had stolen from so many people for so long that his crimes had become impossible to hide. The same arrogance that let him think he could rob his employees and clients indefinitely had blinded him to the digital footprints that would destroy him. Trevor's failed lunch meeting hadn't just been a rejection by potential investors, it had been the final piece of evidence federal investigators needed to close their case. In trying to secure more funding for his incompetent son, Richard had walked them both directly into a federal trap. I left the restaurant in a daze, my mind reeling from what I'd overheard. The sidewalks of Manhattan blurred past as I walked aimlessly, trying to process the revelation that my private investigation had been unnecessary. Federal agents had been building their case long before I'd discovered my stolen bonus. The weekend passed in a surreal haze. Saturday morning, I sat at my kitchen table with Emma, helping her review college applications while internally counting down the hours until Richard's arrest. She was excited about her Northwestern interview next week, completely unaware that her college fund had been temporarily stolen to finance someone else's delusions. "Mom, you've been really distracted lately," Emma said, looking up from her essay. "Is everything okay at work?" Everything was about to explode at work, but I couldn't explain that to my 17-year-old daughter. Just some complicated deals coming together, nothing you need to worry about. She studied my face with the intuition that only children possess. "You know, you can tell me if something's wrong, right? I'm not a little kid anymore." I reached across and squeezed her hand. "I know, sweetheart, and I promise, everything's going to work out fine." It was the truth, even if she couldn't understand it yet. By Tuesday, my stolen bonus would be returned. Her college fund would be secure, and the man who'd robbed us would be facing federal charges. Sunday evening, I received an email that made my heart skip. The message came from an address I didn't recognize with a subject line that simply read, "Monday morning meeting, Ms. Hayes." The email began, "We represent the Securities and Exchange Commission in connection with an ongoing investigation into Morrison and Associates. We would like to meet with you Monday morning at 9 a.m. to discuss your knowledge of irregularities in client, account management, and employee compensation. Your cooperation would be appreciated, though you are not currently considered a target of this investigation. Please confirm your availability." They wanted to interview me. Federal investigators who'd been building their case for months wanted to hear my perspective on Richard's crimes. The email included a phone number and an addresser downtown office building that probably housed the FBI's white-collar crime unit. I stared at the message for 20 minutes, my hands trembling slightly. In less than 12 hours, I'd be sitting across from federal agents describing Richard's systematic theft from employees and clients. The evidence I'd compiled in my home office would finally serve its purpose. Not as ammunition for a personal vendetta, but as corroboration for a federal criminal case. Monday morning arrived gray and cold, matching my mood as I walked toward the federal building. I'd dressed conservatively, navy suit, minimal jewelry, the professional armor of someone about to testify against her former mentor. The security checkpoint felt like crossing a threshold into a different world, one where Richard Morrison was no longer a respected investment manager but a criminal defendant. The conference room was sterile and windowless, furnished with generic, government furniture that screamed taxpayer efficiency. Two agents introduced themselves, Special Agent Sarah Martinez from the FBI's Economic Crimes Unit, and Robert Chen from the Sex Enforcement Division. They were the investigators I'd overheard at La Bernardine, though they looked different in their professional environment. "Thank you for coming in voluntarily," Agent Martinez began. "We understand this is a difficult situation, but your cooperation is crucial to ensuring justice for the victims of Mr. Morrison's crimes." I nodded, my throat dry. "I want to help. What Richard did was wrong, and people deserve to have their money returned." Agent Chen opened a thick file folder. "We'd like to walk through your discovery of the bonus diversions, starting with the Meridian Technology acquisition. Can you describe the normal process for bonus calculations and how you became aware that yours had been redirected?" For the next 2 hours, I recounted everything: the 18-month acquisition process, Richard's promises about life-changing bonuses, the email that shattered my trust, and my subsequent investigation into the firm's financial records. The agents took detailed notes, occasionally asking for clarification about specific transactions or timeline details. "You mentioned discovering irregularities in the Hendricks family trust," Agent Martinez said. "Can you describe what you found?" Walked them through the sophisticated shell game Richard had created, the fake investment entities, the unauthorized fund transfers disguised as legitimate portfolio management. The agents already knew these details, but they wanted my perspective as someone with intimate knowledge of the firm's operations. "Did Mr. Morrison ever acknowledge that client funds were being used for unauthorized purposes?" Agent Chen asked. "He always framed it as strategic investment opportunities, but the pattern was clear once you looked at the timing. Every major bonus diversion coincided with Trevor's startup funding needs. Agent Martinez leaned forward. In your professional opinion, did Mr. Morrison understand that his actions constituted fraud? The question hung in the air. This wasn't just about gathering information, they were building a case for criminal intent. Yes, I said finally. Richard is too experienced and too intelligent to believe that what he was doing was legal. He created elaborate cover stories because he knew he was stealing. At 11:15 a.m., Agent Chen's phone buzzed. He glanced at the message and nodded to his colleague. "Excuse me for a moment," he said, stepping outside the conference room. Agent Martinez smiled grimly. "The search warrants have been executed. Mr. Morrison is currently in federal custody, and his son has been arrested at his apartment. The Morrison and Associates offices are being secured as evidence." Even though I'd known this was coming, hearing it confirmed sent a shock through my system. Right now, federal agents were walking through the offices where I'd spent 12 years of my life, boxing up files that would send Richard to prison. My former colleagues were probably standing in the hallway, watching their careers collapse. In real time? What happens now? I asked. Asset recovery begins immediately. A federal receiver will take control of all client accounts to ensure proper restitution. Your stolen bonus, along with compensation for other affected employees, will be recovered and returned. The Hendricks and other defrauded clients will have their full account balances restored. Justice, it turned out, had its own timeline. While I'd been wrestling with my conscience, federal investigators had been methodically building an airtight case. Richard's arrogance had created a digital paper trail so comprehensive that his conviction was essentially guaranteed. The house of cards hadn't just fallen, it had been systematically demolished by professionals who specialized in financial crimes, and Trevor Morrison, the privileged prince, whose incompetence had started this entire chain of events, was about to learn that federal prison didn't care about Stanford MBA degrees or family connections. The federal building's elevator felt like it was moving through molasses as I descended to the lobby, my mind struggling to process what had just transpired. In the span of 2 hours, I'd gone from potential whistleblower to key witness in a federal fraud case. Richard Morrison, the man I'd respected, feared, and ultimately discovered was a criminal, was sitting in a holding cell somewhere in this building. Agent Martinez had walked me to the elevator, her expression professional, but not unsympathetic. "You did the right thing, Ms. Hayes. Your willingness to cooperate will help ensure that all the victims receive full restitution." The victims, the word echoed in my head as I emerged onto the Manhattan sidewalk. I was a victim, but so were the Hendricks, the Patterson Foundation, Marcus Williams, Sarah Chen, and dozens of others whose trust had been violated for the sake of Trevor Morrison's entrepreneurial delusions. My phone buzzed with a text from my assistant. "Emergency all-hands meeting at 2 p.m. Office in chaos. Federal agents everywhere." What's happening? The news was spreading through Morrison and Associates like wildfire. I could picture the scene, confused employees watching federal agents cart away boxes of files, phones ringing with panicked client calls. The careful professional atmosphere replaced by the surreal circus of a white-collar crime scene I needed to see it for myself. The firm had been my professional home for 12 years, and even though Richard's betrayal had shattered my loyalty, I owed it to my colleagues to witness the end of an era. The Morrison and Associates building was surrounded by news vans when I arrived. Reporters had materialized with the supernatural speed that accompanied high-profile financial scandals, their cameras trained on the entrance like artillery pieces. A uniformed police officer stood guard at the lobby, turning away everyone except employees and federal agents. I showed my company ID and badge to gain entry, though I suspected my employment status was about to become irrelevant. The elevator to our floor felt like ascending to a crime scene, which, technically, it was. The office was unrecognizable. FBI agents moved methodically through the space, photographing documents and sealing evidence boxes in small clusters, speaking in hushed tones and casting nervous glances at the investigators. The air buzzed with uncertainty and fear. These people's livelihoods had just evaporated, and they didn't understand why. Richard's corner office was sealed with yellow crime scene tape, like something from a television drama. Through the glass walls, I could see agents photographing his desk, his awards, the family photos that had always reminded him why he was committing his crimes. The Stanford diploma that had represented Trevor's privilege was now evidence in a federal case. "Victoria." My colleague Jennifer rushed over, her face pale with shock. "Do you know what's happening? They arrested Richard this morning, saying it's fraud, embezzlement. I don't understand any of this." I looked around at the confused faces of people I'd worked with for years. They deserved to know the truth, but I couldn't explain my role in the investigation without revealing information that might compromise the federal case. "I know it's shocking," I said carefully, But if there are criminal charges, there must be evidence to support them. The important thing now is protecting our clients and making sure everyone's interests are represented. Jennifer's eyes widened. The clients? Oh, God, what about the clients? If Richard was stealing money, the federal government will make sure client accounts are protected, I assured her. There are procedures for situations like this. It was surreal. Offering comfort based on information I'd learned while being debriefed by federal agents. These people were processing the collapse of everything they'd believed about their workplace, while I was dealing with the strange relief of knowing that justice was finally being served. Around 3 p.m., a federal marshal arrived with an official notice. Morrison & Associates was being placed under federal receivership, effective immediately. All trading activities were suspended. Client accounts were frozen for audit purposes, and employees were instructed to gather their personal belongings and vacate the premises by 5 p.m. 12 years of my professional life, out in 30 minutes, the diplomas on my wall, the awards from successful deals, the photos of Emma at various ages, all of it reduced to a banker's box that I carried past federal agents and news cameras as I waited for the elevator. I caught sight of Trevor Morrison being led through the lobby in handcuffs. He looked nothing like the confident entrepreneur who'd pitched next-gen financial solutions at La Bernardine, his face showing the first real consequences he'd ever experienced. For his actions, our eyes met for a brief moment as he passed. There was no recognition, no acknowledgement of the role his incompetence had played in destroying both our careers. Even for people named Morrison, the afternoon sun felt harsh after the fluorescent lights of federal custody and corporate collapse. I stood on the sidewalk outside what had been my professional home, holding a box containing the debris of a career built at a criminal enterprise. My phone rang. Emma, calling from school. Mom, there's something on the news about your company. Are you okay? I'm fine, sweetheart. There are some legal issues with the firm, but I'm not involved in any wrongdoing. I'll explain everything when you get home. Are you going to lose your job? I looked back at the building where federal agents were still collecting evidence of Richard Morrison's crimes. Probably. But sometimes that's exactly what needs to happen. The search warrant had been executed with surgical precision. Richard was in custody. Trevor was facing federal charges, and the victims of their crimes would be made whole. Justice, it turned out, had its own sense of timing. The story broke on CNBC at 6 p.m. sharp, complete with footage of Richard being led away in handcuffs and aerial shots of federal agents carrying evidence boxes from the Morrison & Associates building. The anchor's voice carried the prosecutorial tone that financial media reserved for spectacular corporate collapses. Richard Morrison, founder and managing partner of Morrison & Associates, was arrested this morning on federal charges, including wire fraud, embezzlement, and violation of fiduciary duty. Sources close to the investigation suggest that Morrison systematically diverted client funds and employee compensation to finance his son's failed startup ventures, potentially defrauding victims of over $2 million. I sat in my living room with Emma, watching my professional world disintegrate on national television. The news footage showed our office building, the lobby where I'd walked every morning for 12 years, the conference rooms where I'd negotiated deals that had defined my career. Now it was all evidence in a federal criminal case. That's really your boss? Emma asked, staring at the screen as they replayed footage of Richard's arrest. Former boss, I corrected. And yes, that's him, the reporter continued, with the kind of gleeful precision that accompanied white-collar scandals. Trevor Morrison, 28, was also arrested in connection with the scheme. The younger Morrison's startup ventures, including next-gen financial solutions, were allegedly funded through fraudulent transfers from his father's investment firm. Emma turned to me with the directness that only teenagers could manage. Mom, did you know this was happening? The question I'd been dreading. How do you explain to your daughter that her mother had been unknowingly working for a criminal organization? That the college fund she was depending on had been temporarily stolen to finance someone else's incompetence? I suspected something was wrong, I said carefully. When my bonus was canceled to fund Trevor's startup, I started investigating. But I had no idea how extensive the fraud was until federal agents contacted me. Federal agents contacted you. Her eyes widened with a mixture of concern and fascination. I was interviewed as a witness. Because I had access to the firm's financial records, they wanted my perspective on what Richard had been doing. The news segment continued with interviews from legal experts explaining the charges and potential sentences. Wire fraud carried up to 20 years in federal prison. Embezzlement could add another decade. For a man in his 60s, Richard Morrison was looking at spending the rest of his life behind bars. My phone had been ringing constantly since the story broke. Former colleagues seeking information, clients demanding explanations, headhunters wondering about my availability. The financial world was small, and everyone wanted to understand how a respected firm had hidden such extensive fraud. The most difficult call came from Margaret Hendricks, the elderly woman whose retirement savings had been stolen to fund Trevor's delusions. Her voice was shaky but determined when she reached me that evening. "Ms. Hayes, I saw the news about Mr. Morrison. I'm calling because I don't understand what this means for Robert and me. Are we going to lose our savings?" My heart broke for her. At 71, she shouldn't have to worry about recovering stolen retirement funds or understanding federal asset recovery procedures. "Mrs. Hendricks, I can't provide legal advice, but I can tell you that the federal government has procedures to protect defrauded investors. A receiver will be appointed to manage all client accounts and ensure full restitution. But how long will that take? We have medical expenses. The mortgage. I understand your concerns. The authorities assured me that client recovery is their highest priority. You should receive official communications from the court-appointed receiver within days." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen staring at my laptop screen reading the flood of news coverage about Morrison and Associates' collapse. Financial journalists were already dissecting Richard's methods, analyzing the shell companies and fake investment vehicles he'd created to hide his crimes. The human cost was becoming clear. Dozens of employees would lose their jobs. Hundreds of clients would face months of uncertainty while federal receivers untangled the web of fraudulent transactions. Charitable foundations would have their operations disrupted. Retirement accounts would be frozen during the investigation. Richard Morrison's crimes had created ripple effects that would impact innocent people for years. His selfish desire to fund his son's failures had destroyed countless lives. Also, Trevor could continue pretending to be a successful entrepreneur, but there was also something satisfying about watching the truth emerge. For months, I'd suspected that something was fundamentally wrong with the bonus diversions and client account irregularities. My internal sense of right and wrong had been validated by federal investigators who'd reached the same conclusions through much more sophisticated analysis. The news coverage included brief interviews with former employees, most of whom expressed shock and disbelief. "Richard Morrison was a pillar of the financial community," one analyst said. "This is completely out of character for someone with his reputation." They didn't understand what I'd learned through painful experience. Reputation was just marketing, and pillars could be hollow. Richard Morrison had spent decades building a facade of integrity, while systematically betraying the people who trusted him most. The evening news concluded with speculation about plea bargains and sentencing guidelines. Legal experts predicted that Richard would face pressure to cooperate with federal investigators, potentially providing information about other financial crimes in exchange for reduced prison time. As Emma headed upstairs to finish her homework, she paused at the doorway. "Mom, are you going to be okay? I mean, financially?" "We'll be fine," I assured her. "Federal agents told me that stolen bonuses will be recovered and returned. And I'm already talking to other firms about new opportunities." It was true, though the job market for former employees of criminally indicted investment firms was challenging. But I'd rather rebuild my career from scratch than continue enabling Richard Morrison's fraud. The media coverage would continue for weeks dissecting every aspect of the scandal. But tonight I felt something I hadn't experienced since discovering my stolen bonus. The peace that comes from knowing the truth has finally been revealed. The next morning brought a stack of legal documents that would have intimidated a law school graduate. Federal marshals had delivered subpoenas, asset recovery notices, and victim impact statement forms. The bureaucratic machinery of justice grinding into motion. But more challenging than the paperwork were the phone calls from clients who'd trusted me to protect their financial future. Robert Hendricks called at 7 a.m., his voice carrying the confusion of a man who'd spent 4 years believing that hard work guaranteed security. "Victoria, I don't understand these legal papers. They're saying our money was stolen, but our statements showed everything was fine. How is that possible?" I'd been dreading this conversation. Robert and Margaret had trusted Morrison and Associates because I'd personally recommended the firm's conservative investment strategy. My professional reputation had helped Richard gain access to their life savings, which he'd then stolen to fund his son's incompetence. "Mr. Hendricks, I know this is overwhelming. Richard created fake investment documents that made your account appear healthy while he was actually moving your money to unauthorized ventures. The federal investigation has uncovered the real transactions, and the court will ensure you recover every dollar. But Victoria, we're in our 70s. We can't afford to wait years for some legal process. Margaret's medication costs $800 a month, and my pension barely covers the mortgage. What are we supposed to do?" The human cost of Richard's crimes was crushing. While Trevor Morrison had been living in a Soho apartment and driving luxury cars, elderly clients were facing financial ruin. Their trust had been weaponized against them. their prudent investments transformed into gambling stakes for a privileged young man's entrepreneurial fantasies. The federal receiver has emergency procedures for clients facing hardship, I explained. You can apply for interim distributions to cover essential expenses while the full recovery process continues. I'll help you navigate the paperwork. After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen staring at the pile of victim impact statements. Each form represented a person whose life had been disrupted by Richard's greed. The Patterson Charitable Foundation would need to suspend scholarship payments to underprivileged students. The Wilson Estate Trust couldn't pay for a disabled adult's care expenses. Individual families had seen their retirement accounts frozen, their children's education funds stolen, their financial security shattered. My doorbell rang at 9 a.m. Margaret Hendricks stood on my porch, her weathered hands clutching a manila folder. At 71, she looked fragile but determined. The kind of woman who'd raised children during economic uncertainty and wasn't about to be defeated by financial crime. I hope you don't mind me coming by, she said, but I needed to speak with someone who understands what happened to us. I invited her in and made coffee while she spread documents across my dining room table. Bank statements, investment summaries, correspondence with Morrison and Associates, the paper trail of trust that Richard had systematically violated. Robert and I saved every dollar for 40 years, she said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. We never took expensive vacations, never bought fancy cars. We lived modestly because we wanted security in our old age. And now we discover that some rich kid was using our money to play entrepreneur. I watched her examine the fake investment statements Richard had created, each one showing steady growth that had never actually occurred. The sophistication of the fraud was impressive, and heartbreaking. He'd convinced elderly clients that their money was safely invested while gambling it on ventures that had no chance of success. The worst part isn't losing the money, Margaret continued. It's losing faith in the system. We trusted you, and you trusted Mr. Morrison, and he betrayed everyone. How do you rebuild trust after something like this? It was a question I'd been asking myself since discovering my stolen bonus. How do you maintain faith in institutions when the people running them are criminals? How do you continue believing in meritocracy when incompetent children can steal other people's dreams? I don't have good answers, I admitted, but I can tell you that there are still ethical people in finance, and the system does eventually catch criminals like Richard. It took too long, but justice is being served. Margaret nodded thoughtfully. The federal agents were kind when they interviewed us. They assured us that recovering stolen money is their priority. But at our age, even a few months of uncertainty is terrifying. We spent the morning reviewing her legal documents and mapping out the recovery process. The court-appointed receiver would audit all client accounts, trace the fraudulent transactions, and return stolen funds with interest. The timeline was 6 to 12 months for full restitution, though emergency distributions could begin within weeks. As Margaret prepared to leave, she paused at my front door. Victoria, I want you to know that we don't blame you for what happened. You were as much a victim as anyone else. The man who stole from us was the same man who stole your bonus. Her forgiveness was more devastating than her anger would have been. These elderly clients saw me as a fellow victim rather than an enabler, which made Richard's betrayal even more profound. He hadn't just stolen money, he had corrupted the relationships of trust that made the financial system possible. That afternoon, I received a call from David Patterson, chairman of the Patterson Charitable Foundation. His organization had lost $200,000 to Trevor's Ventures, money that had been earmarked for scholarships for underprivileged students. We've had to suspend our spring scholarship program, he said, his voice heavy with disappointment. 40 students who are counting on our support will have to find other funding sources or defer their education. Those kids did everything, right? And they're being punished for Richard Morrison's crimes. The ripple effects kept expanding. Trevor Morrison's incompetence hadn't just cost him funding, it had denied educational opportunities to deserving students, disrupted retirement security for elderly couples, and forced charitable organizations to break promises to vulnerable populations. That evening, I sat in my home office writing my own victim impact statement. The form asked me to quantify the financial and emotional damage caused by Richard's crimes. The $85,000 bonus was easy to calculate, but how do you measure the cost of shattered trust? How do you put a price on losing faith in the mentor who'd shaped your career? I wrote about Emma's college fund, about my parents' medical expenses, about the years of loyalty that had been repaid with theft. But I also wrote about the elderly clients who'd trusted me with their life savings, the charitable foundations that couldn't fulfill their missions, the talented employees who'd lost their careers because of crimes they never suspected. Richard Morrison had stolen more than money. He'd stolen the belief that hard work would be rewarded, that trust would be honored. that the financial system existed to serve clients rather than enrich criminals and their incompetent children. But as I signed the victim impact statement, I felt something unexpected. Gratitude? The federal investigation had validated my suspicions and delivered justice more comprehensively than I could have achieved alone. Sometimes the universe really did have its own sense of right and wrong. 3 weeks after Richard's arrest, I found myself in a sterile federal courthouse conference room, raising my right hand to swear an oath before a court stenographer. The formal testimony would become part of the prosecution's case against Richard and Trevor Morrison. My words preserved for posterity in the legal record that would send them to federal prison. Assistant U.S. Attorney Catherine Walsh sat across from me, her expression professional but warm. She'd built her career prosecuting white-collar criminals, and Richard Morrison represented exactly the kind of sophisticated fraud that federal prosecutors relished dismantling in open court. Ms. Hayes, thank you for your cooperation with this investigation. Your testimony will be crucial in establishing the scope and duration of Mr. Morrison's fraudulent activities. The court stenographer's fingers moved silently across her machine, capturing every word for the official record. This wasn't like my informal interview with FBI agents. This was sworn testimony that could be used in criminal proceedings. And perjury carried its own federal charges. Let's begin with your employment history at Morrison & Associates, Attorney Walsh said. How long did you work for the defendant, and what was your relationship with him? For the next 4 hours, I recounted 12 years of professional history, from my hiring as a junior analyst to my promotion to senior investment director. I described Richard's mentorship, his reputation in the financial community, and the trust that employees and clients had placed in his judgment. When did you first become aware of irregularities in bonus calculations? Walsh asked. I walked through the timeline. The Meridian Technology acquisition, Richard's promises about life-changing bonuses, the email that redirected my $85,000 to Trevor's startup, and my growing suspicions about systematic fraud. Did Mr. Morrison ever acknowledge that employee bonuses were being used for unauthorized purposes? He always framed it as strategic investments, I replied. But when I confronted him about my bonus, he specifically mentioned that the money was being used to fund his son's fintech platform. He called it a strategic reallocation, but he never explained why my earned compensation was being redirected to benefit his family. Attorney Walsh pulled out a thick folder of documents. I'm showing you what's been marked as Government Exhibit 47 email communications between Richard Morrison and his son Trevor. Are you familiar with these documents? I recognized the email headers and formatting from Morrison & Associates' internal systems. The messages detailed Richard's promises to secure additional funding for next-gen financial solutions, including specific references to employee contribution adjustments and client portfolio reallocations. In your professional opinion, did Mr. Morrison understand that these activities constituted fraud? The question hung in the air like a judicial sword. This wasn't about gathering information, it was about establishing criminal intent for federal prosecution. Yes, I said firmly. Richard has over 30 years of experience in investment management. He understands fiduciary duty, securities regulations, and the legal requirements for client asset management. The elaborate shell companies and fake investment entities he created demonstrate sophisticated knowledge of financial crimes, not innocent mistakes. The prosecutor nodded and made notes. Let's discuss the client account irregularities you discovered. Can you walk us through the Hendricks family trust transactions? I described the systematic theft from elderly clients, the fake investment statements that concealed unauthorized fund transfers, and the complex web of shell companies designed to obscure the paper trail. The prosecutors already knew these details, but they needed my first-hand testimony to establish how the fraud had been discovered and documented. Did you ever witness interactions between Richard Morrison and his son that suggested Trevor was aware of the funding sources for his ventures? I thought about the family photos in Richard's office, the casual references to Trevor's brilliant insights, and the pattern of funding that coincided with Trevor's business launches. Trevor may not have known the specific mechanics of how his startups were funded, but he had to understand that his father was providing millions of dollars for ventures that generated no revenue. A Stanford MBA would recognize that level of financial support as unusual, especially given his track record of failed businesses. The questioning continued through the afternoon, covering every aspect of the fraud I'd uncovered. The prosecutors were building a comprehensive case that would make conviction virtually certain, and my testimony provided the insider perspective they needed to explain complex financial crimes to a jury. Ms. Hayes, in your 12 years at Morrison & Associates, did you ever suspect that client funds were being used for unauthorized investments? Not until I started investigating my stolen bonus. Richard's reputation for integrity was unquestioned in our industry. The idea that he was systematically defrauding clients would have seemed impossible before I saw the evidence myself. And, once you discovered the irregularities, what was your response? I continued investigating because I felt obligated to understand the scope of the fraud. When federal agents contacted me, I cooperated fully because I believed victims deserved justice and restitution. Attorney Walsh closed her folder and leaned back in her chair. Thank you, Ms. Hayes. Your testimony has been invaluable in establishing the timeline and methods of Mr. Morrison's criminal activities. As I walked out of the federal courthouse, I felt the weight of finality. My sworn testimony was now part of the legal record that would determine Richard and Trevor Morrison's fate. The evidence was overwhelming, the paper trail was comprehensive, and the prosecution's case was essentially airtight. Justice, I was learning, had its own deliberate pace. Federal prosecutors didn't rush to trial, they built cases methodically, gathering evidence and testimony until conviction became inevitable. Richard Morrison had spent years perfecting his fraud, but federal investigators had spent months perfecting their response. The transcript of my testimony would be filed with the court clerk, preserved in perpetuity as a record of one woman's discovery that her respected mentor was a sophisticated criminal. Somewhere in that sterile courthouse building, Richard Morrison was probably meeting with his defense attorneys, finally understanding that his crimes had consequences he couldn't buy his way out of. The universe, it seemed, really did keep its own books. The letter sat on my kitchen table for 3 days before I found the courage to open it. Federal receivers had been managing the dissolution while prosecutors built their criminal case, but there were still administrative details to resolve. It felt important. After 12 years of dedication to an organization that had systematically betrayed its employees and clients, hereby resign my position as Senior Investment Director, effective immediately. Of fiduciary responsibility and employee loyalty, it was the most satisfying letter I'd ever written. Even though it formalized the end of everything I'd worked to build, the job market for former Morrison and Associates employees was predictably challenging. Headhunters were sympathetic but cautious. Firms were reluctant to hire people whose previous employer had been dismantled by federal investigators. The industry was small, and guilt by association was a real phenomenon. Even for employees who'd been victims rather than accomplices, Emma had been remarkably understanding about our changed circumstances. Her Northwestern interview had gone well, but the uncertainty around my employment made college planning more complicated. She'd started researching scholarship opportunities and considering state schools as backup options. Simultaneously, "Mom, you know I don't need to go to Northwestern, right?" she said one evening while reviewing financial aid applications. "There are plenty of good schools that cost less money." "You earned your spot at Northwestern," I replied firmly. "Richard Morrison stole my bonus, but he didn't steal your opportunities. We'll make it work." I'd been having similar conversations with my parents about their medical expenses and home modifications for her back problems, but they'd been talking about postponing treatment to avoid financial strain on our family. "We managed before you started making good money," Mom had said during one of our weekly phone calls. "We can manage a little longer until you find another position." The ripple effects of Richard's crimes extended far beyond the immediate victims. Families were adjusting budgets, deferring dreams, and making sacrifices because one man had decided that funding his son's incompetence was more important than honoring his obligations to employees and clients. But there were also unexpected sources of support. Jennifer Coleman, my former colleague, had been hired by a competing firm and was advocating for me with their senior partners. Marcus Williams, whose bonus had been stolen 2 years earlier, called to offer encouragement and job hunting advice. Even Sarah Chen reached out from her new position in Chicago, expressing gratitude that someone had finally exposed the truth about Morrison and Associates. "I knew something was wrong when my bonus disappeared," Sarah told me during a long phone conversation, "but I never imagined the scope of what Richard was doing. You did the right thing by cooperating with the investigation. My savings could cover expenses for several months, and the federal receiver had assured me that stolen bonuses would be recovered with interest once the criminal proceedings concluded. Occurred after conviction, which could take 6 to 12 months, depending on plea negotiations and trial schedules. The emotional cost was harder to quantify. 12 years of professional identity had been built around Morrison and Associates, and losing that foundation felt like losing part of myself. I'd been proud to tell people where I worked, confident in the firm's reputation, secure in my role as a respected investment professional. Now, I was unemployed, associated with a criminal enterprise, stability and continuity. But there was also something liberating about the forced reset. I'd spent so many years focused on climbing the corporate ladder that I'd never stopped to consider whether the ladder was leaning against the right wall. Richard's betrayal had shattered my assumptions about loyalty, merit, and institutional integrity. but it had also freed me to reimagine what success actually meant. Emma found me in my home office one evening, surrounded by job applications and industry publications. "Are you okay, Mom? You've seemed different since everything happened with your company." "Different how?" "I don't know, Sitter, but also more determined." About it, she was more perceptive than I'd given her credit for. Richard's betrayal had indeed changed me, stripping away the naive belief that hard work would automatically be rewarded and replacing it. "I learned that the person I respected most in my career was a criminal," I told her. "That's painful, but it's also clarifying. I know now that integrity isn't something you can assume about other people, it's something you have to demand of yourself." The resignation letter had been filed with the federal receiver, marking the official end of my association with Morrison and Associates. But it also marked the beginning of something new, a career built on the hard-earned knowledge that trust must be verified, that loyalty must be reciprocal, and that sometimes the universe requires your active participation to deliver justice. Richard Morrison had taught me one final lesson: the most dangerous criminals are the ones who convince you they're mentors. The interview at Clearwater Capital took place 6 weeks after my resignation from Morrison and Associates, in a glass-walled conference room overlooking Central Park. Unlike Richard's ostentatious corner office with its trophies and family photos, this space felt clean and purposeful. Modern furniture, minimal decoration, and an atmosphere that prioritized substance over status. Rachel Chen, Clearwater's managing partner, had built her firm's reputation on ethical investment practices and transparent client relationships. She was 10 years younger than Richard, but carried herself with an authority that came from competence rather than intimidation. Her first question caught me off guard with its directness. "Victoria, I'm going to ask you something that other firms probably avoided. Do you believe you should have recognized Richard Morrison's criminal activities sooner?" I'd been preparing for this conversation since my first phone call with Clearwater's recruiter. Most potential employers had danced around the Morrison and Associates scandal, treating it like an unfortunate association that required delicate handling. Rachel was confronting it head-on. "Yes," I said without hesitation. "I should have questioned the bonus diversions more aggressively. I should have investigated the client account irregularities when I first noticed them." I allowed my respect for Richard to override my professional skepticism. Rachel nodded approvingly. "Tell me about your decision to cooperate with federal investigators." When I discovered the scope of Richard's fraud, I realized that staying silent would make me complicit in ongoing crimes against elderly clients and charitable organizations. My career concerns became irrelevant compared to the harm being done to innocent people. Even though cooperation would essentially end your employment in the industry, I didn't know it would end my employment. But even if I had known, I would have made the same choice. Some principles are more important than professional survival. The interview continued for 2 hours, covering my investment philosophy, my approach to client relationships, and my vision for ethical financial management. But unlike previous interviews at other firms, Rachel seemed more interested in my character than my credentials. "Clearwater was founded on a simple principle," she explained. "We believe that financial advisory services should benefit clients first, employees second, and shareholders third. That's the opposite of how most firms operate, and it requires hiring people who genuinely prioritize integrity over profit." I thought about Richard's office, where client interests had been subordinated to family legacy and personal enrichment. How do you ensure that principle survives as the firm grows? We hire people who've been tested, people who've faced ethical dilemmas and made difficult choices. Your experience with Morrison and Associates, as painful as it was, demonstrates exactly the kind of moral courage we value. The conversation shifted to practical matters: compensation structure, client portfolio management, and the firm's expansion plans. Clearwater managed $1.2 billion in assets for wealthy individuals and institutions who prioritized ethical investing over maximum returns. The clients were often successful entrepreneurs who'd built their fortunes through principled business practices and wanted their investments to reflect similar values. "We have one final requirement," Rachel said as the interview concluded: "complete transparency with clients about your background. We don't hide our employees' histories, we use them as teaching opportunities about the importance of due diligence and ethical oversight." The offer letter arrived 3 days later, along with a personal note from Rachel. "We believe that integrity is like a muscle. It grows stronger when exercised under pressure. Your experience with Morrison and Associates demonstrates the kind of strength we want on our team." The compensation package was fair, but not extravagant. Base salary of $175,000 plus performance bonuses, tied to client satisfaction rather than revenue generation. More importantly, the firm's culture felt like everything Morrison and Associates had pretended to be: genuinely committed to client welfare, transparent in its operations, and built on sustainable business practices rather than fraudulent schemes. Emma was more excited about my job offer than I'd expected. Mom, this sounds like the kind of place where you won't have to worry about your boss being a criminal. That's a low bar for employment satisfaction, I laughed. But you're right, it feels like a place where I can rebuild my career on solid, ethical ground. My first day at Clearwater Capital was deliberately understated. No grand orientation or executive welcome, just a clean desk, access to client files, and the opportunity to prove that integrity could be profitable when properly managed. The clients I'd been assigned were successful professionals who'd chosen Clearwater specifically because of its ethical reputation. My first client meeting was with Dr. Patricia Williams, a cardiac surgeon who'd built a substantial investment portfolio through careful saving and conservative growth strategies. She'd read about my background in financial media coverage of the Morrison & Associates scandal. Ms. Hayes, she said during our initial consultation, I chose to work with you specifically because of your experience with that fraud case. Someone who risked her career to expose criminal behavior is exactly the kind of person I want managing my money. It was a revelation. My association with Morrison & Associates, which I'd viewed as a career liability, was actually becoming a professional asset. Clients valued advisors who'd demonstrated integrity under pressure, who'd chosen principles over personal advancement when faced with ethical dilemmas. The irony was profound. Richard Morrison's betrayal, which had seemed like the end of my career, was actually becoming the foundation for something better. His crimes had taught me lessons about institutional corruption that made me a more valuable advisor to clients who prioritized ethical investing. As I settled into my new office, I looked out at Central Park and reflected on the journey from Morrison & Associates to Clearwater Capital. The path had been painful, but it had led to a place where my professional values aligned with institutional priorities. Sometimes, the universe really did have its own sense of direction. The federal courthouse was packed with reporters, victims, and legal observers on the morning of Richard Morrison's sentencing hearing. 8 months after his arrest, the case had become a symbol of white-collar justice, a test of whether wealthy criminals would face meaningful consequences for systematic fraud. I sat in the gallery's second row, directly behind Margaret and Robert Hendricks, who'd driven down from Westchester to witness the conclusion of their financial nightmare. Richard looked smaller than I remembered. His expensive suits replaced by a standard gray prison uniform. 8 months in federal custody had aged him considerably. His hair was completely white now, his face drawn and hollow. The man who'd once commanded boardrooms with casual authority now sat hunched at the defendant's table, flanked by lawyers who'd failed to negotiate a plea agreement that would spare him significant prison time. Judge Patricia Brennan called the courtroom to order with the gravity that federal sentencing hearings demanded. She'd presided over dozens of white-collar cases during her 15 years on the bench, and her reputation for stern but fair justice had made her a favorite among prosecutors who specialized in complex financial crimes. Mr. Morrison, Judge Brennan began, you have been convicted on 17 counts of wire fraud, 6 counts of embezzlement, and 3 counts of violation of fiduciary duty. Before I impose sentence, I want to hear from the victims whose lives you've damaged through your criminal conduct. The victim impact statements began with Robert Hendricks, his voice shaking as he approached the podium. At 73, he shouldn't have been standing in federal court explaining how his retirement savings had been stolen to fund someone else's delusions. Your Honor, my wife and I worked for 45 years to save $1.2 million for our retirement. Our money had been given to his son's startup companies, which failed and lost everything. We're in our 70s and we can't replace that money. We've had to delay medical treatments and consider selling our home because of what he did to us. Margaret Hendricks followed her husband, her statement brief but devastating. Mr. Morrison, you stole our security. We saved every dollar because we didn't want to be a burden on our children in our old age. Now we might have to move in with our daughter because we can't afford our mortgage. You took 40 years of careful saving and gambled it on your son's business ideas. You should be ashamed. David Patterson from the Patterson Charitable Foundation spoke next, explaining how the theft of $200,000 had forced them to cancel scholarship programs for underprivileged students. 40 students who earned those scholarships are now struggling to afford college because Mr. Morrison decided their education was less important than funding his son's failures. I watched Richard's face during the victim statements, looking for signs of remorse or understanding. He stared at the defense table, occasionally whispering to his lawyers, but showing no visible reaction to the human cost of his crimes. Even facing federal prison, he seemed incapable of acknowledging the damage he'd caused. Trevor Morrison sat in the gallery behind his father, looking like a broken man. His plea agreement had resulted in a 5-year sentence in exchange for cooperation with prosecutors. But seeing his father face decades in prison had clearly shattered whatever remained of his privileged worldview. When the victim statements concluded, Judge Brennan addressed Richard directly. "Mr. Morrison, you have the right to speak before I impose sentence. Do you wish to make a statement?" Richard stood slowly, his lawyer's hand on his shoulder. For a moment, I thought he might offer genuine apology to the people he'd harmed. Instead, he delivered a carefully crafted statement that blamed everyone except himself. "Your Honor, I deeply regret the pain that my actions have caused. I want the victims to know that I never intended to harm anyone. I believed my son's business ventures would succeed and that all invested funds would be returned with profit. I made poor judgment calls, but they came from a desire to help my clients achieve better returns, not from criminal intent." It was a masterpiece of self-deception. He was still claiming his crimes had been misguided attempts to help people, rather than selfish betrayals of trust. Judge Brennan's expression hardened as Richard returned to his seat. "Mr. Morrison, your statement demonstrates a continued failure to accept responsibility for systematic fraud that victimized dozens of innocent people. You created elaborate schemes to hide your theft of client funds and employee compensation. You violated every principle of fiduciary duty and used your reputation to gain access to victims' life savings." The courtroom fell silent as Judge Brennan consulted her notes. Federal sentencing guidelines for financial crimes were complex, but Richard's case involved aggravating factors that would push his punishment toward the maximum allowable range. "Mr. Morrison, you are hereby sentenced to 18 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. You will pay full restitution to all victims, including interest and penalties, in the amount of $3.2 million. Your assets will be liquidated to satisfy these obligations, and you will surrender your investment advisor licenses permanently." 18 years. At 64, Richard Morrison would be 82 when released from federal prisoning. He survived his sentence. The man who'd stolen my bonus to fund his son's startup would spend the rest of his productive life behind bars. Expected sadness rather than satisfaction. Justice had been served, but it couldn't undo the damage he'd caused or restore the trust he'd violated. The elderly clients would recover their money, but they'd also learned that the financial system they'd trusted could be corrupted by the very 5 years in federal prison and a lifetime ban from the securities industry. His cooperation with prosecutors had reduced his sentence, but he would still spend his early 30s learning that privileged backgrounds didn't exempt anyone from the consequences of financial crimes. Walking out of the federal courthouse, I thought about the journey from discovering my stolen bonus to witnessing Richard's sentencing. The universe had indeed delivered justice, but it had required the participation of federal investigators, prosecutors, judges, and ordinary citizens, willing to speak truth about the damage caused by white-collar crime. Sometimes justice needed help finding its way. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, thick and official. Restitution payments were being processed, but holding the actual check in my hands felt surreal, tangible, symbol that justice could sometimes be quantified in dollars and cents. $94,750, my stolen $85,000 bonus, and administrative penalties that Richard's crimes had cost the court system. It was more money than I'd originally been owed, though no amount could compensate for the sleepless nights, the career uncertainty, or the shattered faith in institutions I'd once respected. Emma found me staring at the check in our kitchen. My coffee growing cold as I processed the significance of this moment. "Is that the money from your old company?" "It's the money Richard Morrison stole from me," I corrected. "The federal court ordered him to pay full restitution to all his victims, so we can afford Northwestern." Now, we could already afford Northwestern, but this makes everything easier. The restitution process had been remarkably efficient once Richard's assets were liquidated. Had also been confiscated the Soho apartment, the BMW, the country club memberships funded by stolen money. Every dollar that could be traced to their crimes was being returned to victims. Margaret Hendricks called that afternoon, bright with relief for the first time since I'd known her. "Victoria, we received our check today, the full $400,000 plus interest." Robert and I sat at the kitchen table and cried. David Patterson had called to report that the Patterson Charitable Foundation had received their full restitution and would be resuming scholarship programs for the spring semester. The 40 students who'd been denied funding would now be able to afford college, their educational dreams restored along with the stolen money. Money that would help Marcus pay for his daughter's medical treatments and allow federal asset recovery procedures, but the restoration went beyond financial restitution. The SEC had implemented new oversight procedures for investment advisory firms. For family-controlled businesses, Richard's crimes had exposed systemic weaknesses in regulatory oversight, and federal agencies were closing loopholes that had allowed sophisticated fraud to continue undetected for years. My career at Clearwater Capital was thriving in ways I hadn't expected. My client base was growing steadily, filled with successful professionals who valued ethical investment management over maximum returns. Dr. Patricia Williams had introduced me to several colleagues who were looking for advisors with proven moral courage. She risked her career to expose criminal behavior. That's exactly the kind of person I want handling my money. Which had seemed like the end of my career was actually transforming me into a more valuable advisor. Clients trusted me because I'd been tested by institutional corruption and had chosen principles over personal advancement. Emma had received her acceptance letter from Northwestern the previous week, along with a partial scholarship that would cover tuition costs, who valued personal growth over perfect circumstances. "Mom," she said, one evening while reviewing course catalogs, "I've been thinking about what I want to study. Care about doing the right thing?" My parents had also benefited from the restitution payments. Wheelchair accessibility features that would help them maintain independence for years to come. "We're proud of what you did," Dad had said during our weekly phone call. The restoration wasn't complete. Nothing could undo the months of uncertainty, the damaged trust in financial institutions, or the careers disrupted by Richard's crimes, but the federal system had demonstrated that white-collar criminals could face meaningful consequences. That stolen money could be recovered. Home office reviewing client portfolios and reflecting on the journey from Morrison & Associates to Clearwater Capital. The restitution check was deposited in my bank account. Emma's college fund was fully secured, and my parents' medical needs were covered. Built on ethical foundations, the universe, it seemed, really did know how to balance its books. Sometimes justice required patience, but when it finally arrived, it came with interest. 1 year later, I sat in my home office on a quiet Sunday morning, writing in the leather-bound journal that had become my refuge during the most challenging period of my life. Weekly, with insights about market behavior and institutional ethics that would have made her professor proud. My parents were healthy and secure in their modified home. The restitution money had been invested conservatively, generating steady returns that would support our family for years to come. The journal entry I was writing wasn't about financial markets or client strategies. It was a reflection on the journey from betrayal to justice, from institutional corruption to personal integrity. The Morrison & Associates scandal had ended exactly 1 year ago with Richard's sentencing, but its lessons continued shaping my understanding of success, loyalty, and moral courage. I've been thinking about what this experience taught me about the difference between reputation and character. Richard had an impeccable reputation, Harvard degree, successful firm, respect throughout the financial community, but his character was hollow, corrupted by the belief that family loyalty justified criminal behavior. The contrast with my current workplace couldn't have been more stark. Clearwater Capital operated on principles that Richard had only pretended to embrace: genuine fiduciary responsibility, transparent client relationships. Rachel Chen had built a firm culture where ethical behavior was rewarded and corner-cutting was career suicide. My client base had grown to $150 million in assets under management. Me out because of my experience with the Morrison scandal. They didn't want advisors who'd never been tested by institutional pressure. They wanted someone who'd proven that integrity mattered more than personal advancement. The irony is profound. I continued writing. Richard's betrayal, which seemed like the end of my career, actually became the foundation for something better. No, I'll protect their interests even when it's personally costly. Emma had visited the previous weekend, bringing her Northwestern textbooks and endless questions about real-world applications of economic theory. She was particularly fascinated by behavioral economics, the study of how psychological factors influence financial decisions. Her senior thesis would examine how institutional trust breaks down in the aftermath of financial fraud. "Mom, your story is basically a case study in principal agent problems," she'd said over dinner. "Richard was supposed to be acting as your agent and the client's agent, but he was actually serving his own interests and his son's interests. The system only worked when external oversight, the federal investigation, forced accountability." She was right, though I hadn't thought about it in such academic terms. He'd used his position as a steward of other people's money to serve his own family's interests, creating exactly the kind of moral hazard that regulations were designed to prevent. The Hendricks had sent me a Christmas card showing them on vacation in Florida, their first trip in years, funded by the confidence that their retirement savings were secure. Margaret had included a note. "We're finally able to enjoy our golden years because you had the courage to speak up. Thank you for being our guardian angel." Ordinary people find themselves in extraordinary situations where their choices affect countless others. My decision to investigate Richard's crimes and cooperate with federal prosecutors had protected elderly couples, charitable organizations, and hardworking employees who'd been systematically victimized. The The most important lesson I wrote in my journal is that integrity isn't something you possess, something you choose. Repeatedly, especially when choosing, it costs you something valuable. Richard chose family loyalty over professional ethics. I chose professional ethics over career security. Both choices had consequences, but only one was sustainable. The Morrison & Associates building had been sold to pay victim restitution. The offices converted to a tech startup incubator. Sometimes I walked past it during lunch meetings in that part of Manhattan, remembering the years I'd spent believing that hard work and loyalty would be automatically rewarded for building something better. My phone buzzed with a text from Trevor Morrison's ex-girlfriend, someone I'd never met but who'd reached out after reading about the case in financial media. Wanted you to know that Trevor got out of federal prison last month. He's working at a car rental agency in Newark and living in a halfway house. He asked me to tell you that he's sorry for what his family did to you. I'd received from anyone in the Morrison family, filtered through a third party and arriving years after the crimes had been committed. But it suggested that federal prison had taught Trevor something that Stanford Business School hadn't. Actions have consequences, and privilege doesn't exempt anyone from accountability. I closed the journal and looked out at the Manhattan skyline. Thinking about the path from stolen bonus to ethical advisor, Richard Morrison had intended to destroy my financial future to fund his son's delusions. Instead, he'd accidentally created the experiences that made me more valuable to clients who prioritized integrity over maximum returns. The universe, my willingness to investigate, to cooperate with federal agents, and to testify against my former mentor had been essential to ensuring that victims were protected and criminals faced consequences. Emma would graduate from Northwestern next year, with a deep understanding of how financial systems could be corrupted and how institutional oversight could prevent such corruption. She'd inherited not just financial security, but also the knowledge that standing up for principles was sometimes costly but always worthwhile. Since before discovering my stolen bonus, complete alignment between my personal values and my professional work, Clearwater Capital wasn't perfect, but it was built on sustainable principles rather than criminal schemes. Sometimes the best revenge was simply building. Richard Morrison was serving his federal sentence. Trevor was learning about honest work, and their victims had been made whole. The system had worked, slowly and imperfectly, but ultimately effectively. Justice, I'd learned, was patient but persistent, and sometimes it really did have the last word.